My name is Dr. Thaslim Alani Verji, and welcome to this session on fueling your passion through radical self-care. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and I'm hoping that this is going to be an informative session. And I'll just wait for my slides to show up if possible. Thank you. Okay, so why do we talk about fueling our passion through radical self-care? Well, we know that the burnout is real. We know that 35% of Canadians report experiencing burnout. 35%, that's a lot of us. And for those of you out there, you can think about what burnout means to you. Often it means feeling a lack of energy, a lack of motivation, not feeling perhaps that fire or that drive that you're used to having. And it can include things like social isolation, just not feeling yourself, feeling more tired, things like that. We also know that in the nonprofit world, those rates are higher. Some research that came out last year from Stanford Social Innovation Review tells us that that number is close to 50%. Now, one might think that if folks are working in nonprofit, hopefully they're working for causes that are important to them. And so we would hope that when we're working for things that are important to us, it actually feels more protective towards burnout, and that we might be less likely to experience burnout when we're working for things that are important to us. The reality is that rates for burnout in the nonprofit industry are higher, and that working on causes that are important to us are not necessarily protective factors, but there are reasons behind that. Often when we're working towards things that are important to us, we're giving and giving and giving because we know it's important. But what happens is we end up giving in ways that aren't necessarily intentional, or alternatively, we end up giving beyond our capacity. We also know that there are lots of consumerist approaches to engaging in self-care, whether that's, new bath soaps and salts and bath bombs, candles, fluffy socks, weighted blankets. And it's not to say that those things aren't going to be helpful. They might be helpful in the moment. But when we're talking about burnout, lighting your favorite scented candle isn't necessarily going to be what you need. Even if you burn that candle every single day as a preventative strategy, that's probably not going to be enough when we're feeling overextended and overwhelmed. And so we have to find alternative ways for helping ourselves, caring for ourselves. And this is where radical self-care comes in. So let's kind of talk about self-care first, because this is why we're here. We're not here to talk about burnout. So the term self-care came about from biomedical beginning. So it was really grounded in what it meant to engage in care for ourselves outside of what our physician was giving to us. And so whether that included, making sure we're eating healthy or getting physical activity, and whatever was prescribed to us as part of our healthcare was how self-care was defined. However, in the 60s and 70s with the Black Panther Party, and then the 80s with Audre Lorde, there was an understanding that for many folks, marginalization means that we're not getting the same access to healthcare specifically. And so if healthcare is inequitable, just like social systems are inequitable, people had to take care of themselves because they couldn't trust the system to do it for them. And so then self-care became political. It was no longer about what your physician told you to do. You couldn't even trust that you would get access to a physician or that you would get appropriate care from a physician. Sometimes this is still the case today for many people. And so then it was recognized that even in our community work, even in our politics, we still had to take care of ourselves, and we had to take care of our communities because no one else was going to do it for us. Self-care became survival. We saw, or I suppose we didn't see because many of us probably weren't around at that time, but in the Black Panther Party movement, when folks would get together, when there were meetings, self-care was part of how groups revolutionized. There was an understanding that the movement couldn't happen if people were not investing in themselves, in their survival, in their well-being, and in their growth. And so self-care was necessary in order to be able to make change in the world. And so, how can we take care of ourselves in a world that pushes us to give and to give and to give, and also ends up neglecting ourselves in the process? Because that's what capitalism often does, right? It's forcing us to keep going, decreasing the amount of resources or funding that we have access to, and yet often making us feel like we are the reason that targets are not being met or work is not getting accomplished. It's not about what we had access to or how much support we got in our work, but rather it's focused internal on what we didn't do wrong, what we need to work harder on. And so if we are being constantly forced and pushed to give of ourselves, of our time, and of our energy, how do we prevent burnout? So radical self-care, as we're going to discuss today, includes two components. So when we think about the word radical, we're really talking about two specific things. One, radical means completely. This means the entirety of ourselves. And so when we think about self-care, we need to think about every aspect of ourselves, but also every aspect of our lives. Sorry. My apologies. I'm just going to mute myself for a second. Okay, I'm back. Secondary to that is a recognition that radical can also have political meanings. Goodness. This means that when we're thinking about what radical self-care means, we have to think about it politically. Our existence, our work, all of it is political. Okay, hopefully that is the last of it. So when we think about radical self-care back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was really grounded in politics. There was an understanding that we all had to take care of ourselves specifically for survival. There was also an understanding that we had to take care of our communities for survival because we were part of those communities. And so when we think about radical self-care, we're really talking about two big components. One is that we need to take care of ourselves, our entire selves completely. This means our physical well-being, our mental and emotional well-being, our spiritual well-being, every single part of it. It also means these are not practices that we come in and out of. It's not about the bubble bath or reading the really good book or engaging in prayer. All of those things are important. But what I'm talking about here is making sure that every single part of us and every single action that we take and every single decision that we make, these are all acts of self-care. Self-care is no longer this separate thing that we do, but rather self-care is something that we're doing all of the time. The second component of that is recognizing that we all belong as part of community. And so then self-care also means community care. Now, for many of us, we've probably been told things like, slow down or say no more, or you're taking on too much. But for those of us who feel so connected to community, which many of us do, the idea of not doing for community doesn't sit well a lot of the time. It actually feels like if we said no to those things that are really important to us in our community, we'd actually be doing the opposite of self-care. And this is the thing. Because we are all part of community, serving community, working for community, this is part of our self-care. And so we need to shape our self-care in recognition that we are part of that community. So if we just pause and ask ourselves, and you can put it in the chat if you want to, or you can just think about it for yourself. What do you do to take care of your entire self? What are some of the things that are part of your everyday practice that you know are important for your well-being? This can be your morning coffee. This can be things like listening to a really good playlist on your way to work. It can mean engaging in meditation. It can mean having scheduled time at the gym. Um, it can mean a skincare routine. It can mean talking to your family. Whatever it is, what do you do to take care of your entire self? So I'll just give folks a few seconds to think about that. And again, put it in the chat if you'd like. Okay. So when we think about passion, we all have passion. It's what drives us. But often when we're feeling burnt out, this can get in the way of us being able to really do the things that are important to us. We may not even be burnt out. We might just be doing the everyday things that we have to do. And yet, these are also the things that are keeping us away from what is important to us. And so, I'm going to introduce to you the principles of radical self care in the hopes that these things can help us build a life where we get to fuel our passion. We get to do the things that are important to us, and we get to feel good about it. Now, the reason this is important is because often we experience that burnout not because we're necessarily overwhelmed, but likely because we're overwhelmed doing the things that are not satisfying for us, right? When we find the things that are satisfying and meaningful for us, and we get to spend our time and our energy doing those things, we usually don't feel overwhelmed, or at least so overwhelmed that we feel burnt out over a longer period of time. This is because we're experiencing the benefits of the work that we're doing. And so when we can refocus on the things that are important to us, this in and of itself is an act of self-care, and this is protective towards burnout. So the first thing we want to do is to define our passions. Now, we might know the things that excite us. So for example, whether that is gardening, I know I love dance. So dance is something that I feel quite passionate about. And most of us have several passions. I'm so sorry, folks. I lost my voice last week. These are the repercussions of that. Um, if we have many passions, then we can focus our energy on many things. But often what's happening is we're so busy doing the everyday things that we don't even know what drives us anymore. We don't know what we're passionate about, or we know about what drives us in really vague ways. But when it comes to the action and when it comes to the doing, we have less connection to that passion. And so the first thing we want to do is define our passions. And we can even make a list. What drives us? What fuels us? What lights our fire? And while these may be big things like social justice or dance or sunshine, we also want to figure out what the actions are in between. So when we look at some of our values, we can use our values to be a compass that guides us. For example, if you are someone that loves beauty, how do you let beauty be something that drives you? If you are someone that is driven by love, how do you invite love into everything that you do? If you are someone that is fueled by justice, how do you invite justice into everything you're doing? So now we have these topics that we are passionate about, but we also have these values that we can bring into every single thing that we're doing. When we are able to define our passions, when we are able to figure out what drives us, we can bring that into every single thing that we do. So for example, if a value of mine is beauty, let's say, not only how can I make my space beautiful or how can I make myself beautiful, but when given a choice, for example, If I'm sitting in traffic and I can take the scenic route, which will take me 15 minutes longer, or I can take my regular road, maybe I'm going to choose the scenic route, and that way I can invite more beauty into my life. Or if I'm trying to figure out how to prepare my food, maybe I'm going to spend the extra 30 seconds to make my plate look beautiful because I know it's going to allow for a more meaningful experience. While that might seem like a really small thing, these are examples of how we can bring our values into every single decision that we make. Now, beauty might not necessarily present itself in every single opportunity, but when we figure out what those values are, and there are probably several of them, and when we figure out what our passions are, we can actually bring those things together in order to build decisions and life choices that feel good for us. Now, the second part of this is flexibility and self-compassion. Now, we know that there are basic self-care things, right? We know that we need to eat nutritious food and shower as much as we're going to shower, regardless of when that is. But one of the things we want to remember is that what might serve as self-care sometimes might actually not serve as self-care in other times. For example, there might be some days where a shower is exactly what we need, and we know that that is what is going to be taking care of ourselves. And then there might be other days where, even though we think we should shower, that shower is not what's going to be most helpful to us. Maybe just staying in bed in our pajamas is going to be what is most effective for our care on that day. It's about having the flexibility to understand that while we might have a framework that works for us most of the time, we also want to be able to come in and out of that framework based on where we are at on any given day. This means that we want to have an understanding of ourselves and our own needs, but also the context. Similarly, saying yes to driving someone to the airport might feel like the opposite of self-care on a lot of days, but on some days it might feel like exactly what we needed to do to take care of ourselves. The context and our values, our needs, all of those things come into play when we are making decisions. And so this requires self-awareness. Now, in step one, we've kind of opened ourselves up to self-awareness around what is important to us in the grand scheme of things. This second point requires us to be self-aware moment by moment, so that it's not only following this framework that is driven by our values and our passion, but also then thinking about what do we need in any given moment. What is going to make us feel like we are living in line with our values at any given moment? When we can do those check-ins and when we can make sure that we are making decisions based on our needs, this is what allows us to make sure that we are constantly thinking about our needs and doing our best to live by our needs. Now, you might say, okay, that sounds great, but in the real world, there are lots of demands that are coming at us that we can't necessarily say no to. Sure, that's fair. But I think part of this is also recognizing that when you say yes to that thing you don't want to do, that is still allowed to be self-care. Because in any given moment, again, we are evaluating what is important to us. Job security is allowed to be important to us. Financial freedom is. Making sure we have a good relationship with our employer. All of those things are really important to us too. And so even though the task might not be one that we want to do, satisfying those other things might be. It's about taking stock of what's important to us and recognizing that we are allowed to have that interplay, and that there's also the reality that sometimes things just need to get done. But when we can line all of it up, when we can say, hey, I'm choosing to say yes to this, even though this task is not one that I wanted to do, because it satisfies these other things that are important to me, it gives us the power to choose. The other part of this is self-compassion. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say yes to things we wish we would have said no to. We're going to try to practice saying no, and it's not going to land well, or it might start as a no that turns into a yes because we feel bad. We might end up picking things that don't line up with our values or our passions, and that is okay. We can also work to be gentle with ourselves and to practice self-compassion. This is about realizing that all of us are human and all of us are worthy of care just because we exist, not because of how much we do for other people or how much we make ourselves invaluable to other people. We are just worthy of care for existing just the way everyone else is. And so, can we treat ourselves the way we treat other people? We can try, and maybe that will allow us to be a little bit more gentle with ourselves. Maybe we had a few more bowls of ice cream than we intended to, or we napped for longer than we intended to, or we were so frustrated that we said no in a way that we didn't intend to, or maybe we said yes in a way we didn't intend to. Regardless, recognizing that we're going to make mistakes or we're going to make choices that we wish we wouldn't have made, and that that's part of our learning and our growing. It's also about recognizing that sometimes we need to be gentle and compassionate with ourselves around the decisions that we do make that are in line with our values. For example, if it is important for us to work out, let's say every single day, and there is a day where we are not feeling well and we decide not to work out. Now, for any of you who have gone through that before, there are two kind of outcomes here, right? One is we either feel really mad at ourselves for being lazy and skipping the workout and not pushing ourselves hard enough. Or we recognize that the value here is around health, and usually that means that we work out every day, but health also means giving ourselves a rest when we need that rest. And so we be gentle with ourselves and we recognize that we're actually honoring our needs. And right now, our need is telling us that it wasn't a good day to work out. Many of you are probably familiar with that harsh critic voice. And we know that often it's that voice that pushes us to get things done. But that's also a trick that we convince ourselves that we need to be harsh with ourselves, because if we weren't harsh with ourselves, we might not get things done. But it's not actually true. We could be our own cheerleaders. We could encourage ourselves as opposed to being an angry coach with ourselves. If we cheer, if we motivate, if we empower ourselves, if we are our best cheerleaders, then perhaps we're doing the things that are important to us because they're important to us, not because we're making ourselves feel bad in the process. The third component here is to identify our strengths. And we all have strengths. When we can do the things that we are good at doing most of the time, then we're actually more likely to feel effective. It's one thing to be passionate about something. It's another thing to be passionate and effective. So, for example, and maybe this is a really silly one, but I really enjoy assembling furniture. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. It makes me feel like I accomplished something and I was very productive. It makes me feel strong. I'm not very good at it though. And so usually it means that a shelf is turned around and I have to realize halfway through, take the whole thing apart, switch it around. So in this case, let's say I'm passionate about assembling furniture, but I'm not very good at it. If I'm going to spend my time and energy doing things that I'm not very good at, I'm probably going to walk away not feeling very great about myself. This doesn't mean we don't do things that we're not good at. But perhaps I don't commit to building an entire room of furniture just to fuel that. Maybe I pick one piece of furniture and ask someone else to do the rest, or delegate. When we recognize what our passions are and also what we are effective in, that allows us to be intentional in our choices of how we are spending our time. And so we can think about it in some sort of grid, right? We have the things that we are passionate and effective in. We have the things that we are passionate about and less effective in. And then we have the things that we might not be passionate about, but we are quite effective at doing. And then the things we're not passionate about and we're not effective at doing. If we can focus our time and our energy on the things that we are passionate about and the things that we are effective at doing, this is the most protective action that we can take. When we think about what contributes to burnout, especially in the nonprofit industry, folks are working in the industries that they might feel passionate about, assuming that that is the case. And yet, burnout is higher probably because folks are not actually doing the tasks that they are most effective at doing. They might be burdened with projects that are not actually feeling like they are contributing to the larger cause. When we can feel effective, like we had a really good day where we made change, now we're taking our passion and we're taking effectiveness and we're putting it together. This is where we want to spend most of our time. Now, realistically, obviously, we can't spend all of our time there, but we probably spend none of our time there when we don't know what our passions are and when we don't know what we are effective at. So when we can at least figure out what those things are, we can try to make decisions that contribute to that first quadrant. If we're not passionate about something and not effective at it either, hopefully we can just delegate it away. And when we're passionate about something and we're less effective at it, maybe we can try to find ways to either become more effective or to support those individuals who are more effective. Maybe we can share our passion so that those who are actually effective at doing it can do it more effectively, because now that becomes their first quadrant. When we can all work together that way, then we all get to do things that we're passionate about and that we're effective in. The last piece of this is figuring out how to say no, because if we're trying to do the things that we're passionate about and that we're effective at doing, this will require us to not do some of those other things. Now, all of us will figure out what our own style of saying no is, and maybe some of us are already quite comfortable at saying no. If you're not that comfortable at saying no, or you feel like you are so burnt out that the easier thing is to say yes, which I've definitely had that experience, then making sure that we're giving ourselves a window of time before committing to something. So you can say, you know what, I need to figure out if this is something I have capacity for. Let me get back to you tomorrow. And then we can take that time to figure out what is going to work for us and what's not going to work for us. The other thing we can do is to thank the person for thinking of us, or thank the person for the opportunity, and let them know that right now we don't have enough capacity, or we won't be able to give it the attention that it needs. And so we can either do it when one of the other things is off our plate, or we can help them identify someone else who might have the capacity and might actually want the opportunity. So when we can figure out what our no style is, this allows us to shape our language and shape our no's in a way that aligns with our values. This is often one of the biggest barriers to being able to choose the things that are most important to us, is that we don't know how to say no, or we feel really bad at saying no. When we can get rid of that shame, when we can get rid of that guilt, and when we can know that by saying yes to the things that are important to us, we're actually increasing our capacity to do so much more, because we're preventing burnout and because we're investing in ourselves. This is what really allows us to be more effective. So I'd like to thank you all for joining me today to learn about radical self-care. Hopefully you're walking away feeling like you have some tangible things that you can do to start taking care of yourself, and not looking at self-care like this side thing that we need to do to feel good, but rather something that we integrate into our entire lives. And I'd like to just include this last slide in case you would like to give feedback on the talk. So I'm always looking to learn and improve. So again, thank you everyone so much for joining me today.